This is lecture 71 in the ABCs of Communism series, and the third one on these islands of the South Asian Indian Ocean. And now we're dealing with communism in the Andaman Islands. I want to start out first of all with a brief discussion of the physical geography and geology, so that you know where you are and how we got there. The Andaman Islands form an archipelago in the Bay of Bengal between India to the west and Myanmar to the north and east. Politically, most are part of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Union Territory of India. Today they are. Another small number of them in the north of the archipelago, including the Coco Islands, belong to Myanmar. The 10-degree channel, as it's called, separates the Andamans from the Nicobar Islands to the south, and the highest point is Saddle Peak at 2,402 feet on North Andaman Island. The Andaman Archipelago is an oceanic continuation of the Burmese Arakan-Yoma Range in the north and the Indonesian archipelago in the south. It has 325 islands that cover an area of 2,474 square miles, with the Andaman Sea to the east between the islands and the coast of Burma. North Andaman Island is 177 miles south of Burma, although a few smaller Burmese islands are closer, including the 3 Coco Islands. The Andaman Nicobar Archipelago that forms the western margin of the Andaman Sea is a sediment-dominated accretionary wedge, that is, an outer arc island, associated with a convergent margin tectonic setting. The Andaman accretionary ridge consists of 2 stratigraphically and structurally distinct terrains, juxtaposed and telescoped into a north-south trending high-relief fold thrust belt, formed along the obliquely subducting eastern margin of the Indo-Australian Oceanic Lithospheric Plate. The geology and structure of the ridge reflects the complexity of the evolving tectonics and stratigraphy of an accretionary wedge. Pre-Cretaceous metasedimentary rocks, Upper Cretaceous ophiolites, and Paleogene-Neogene sedimentary formations indicate rapid spatial and temporal changes in lithology, sedimentology, sedimentary, and tectonic environments and paleogeographic settings. The subsoil of the Andaman Islands consists essentially of late Jurassic to early Eocene ophiolites and sedimentary argillacous and algal limestones deformed by numerous deep faults and thrusts with ultramafic igneous intrusions. There are at least 11 mud volcanoes on the islands. So for those 2 paragraphs will mostly be of interest to people that have a geological background. The climate is typical of tropical islands of similar latitude, that is always warm, but with sea breezes. Rainfall is irregular, usually dry during the northeast monsoon, and very wet during the southwest monsoon. So, as for the biogeography, the natural vegetation of the Andamans is tropical forest, with mangroves on the coast. The rainforests are similar in composition to those of the west coast of Burma. Most of the forests are evergreen, but there are areas of deciduous forest on North Andaman, Middle Andaman, Baratang, and parts of South Andaman Island. The South Andaman forests have profuse growth of epiphytic vegetation, mostly ferns and orchids. And the Andaman forests are largely unspoiled despite logging and the demands of the fast-growing population driven by immigration from the Indian mainland. There are protected areas on Little Andaman, Narcondam, North Andaman, and South Andaman. These preserve the coast and the marine rainforest wildlife from introduced species of rats, dogs, cats, and the elephants of Interview Island and North Andaman. Now, the Andaman forest contained 200 or more timber-producing species of trees, out of which about 30 varieties are commercial, including gurgeon and padauk. And I use the scientific names behind each of these, but I won't bother with that here. The following ornamental woods are very important: marblewood, padauk, silver gray, chewy, cocoa. The padauk wood is sturdier than teak and is widely used in furniture making. There are burr wood and buttress root formations in the Andaman padauk. The largest piece of buttress known from Andaman was a dining table 13 by 7 feet. The largest piece of burwood was a dining table for 8. And the holy rudraksha, and the scientific name, and aromatic dupe resin trees are found here. The Andaman Islands are also home to a lot of animals, and many of them are endemic. And then I go through, and again, I won't mention it, but I mention the scientific name after each of these. But most important endemic animals are the Andaman mammals. Are the Andaman spiny shrew, the Andaman shrew, the Jenkins shrew, the Andaman horseshoe bat, the Andaman rat. The banded pig, Sus scrophivitatus, also known as the Andaman wild boar, and once thought to be an endemic species, is protected by the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, as are the spotted deer, the Indian muntjac, the sandbar, all introduced to the Andaman Islands through although the sandbar did not survive. Interview Island has the largest wildlife sanctuary in the territory. In Middle Andaman, it holds a population of feral elephants, which were brought in for forest work by a timber company and released when the company went bankrupt. This population has been subject to research studies, but it'd be interesting to see how many of these elephants are roaming around that island. At any rate, endemic birds include 14 species, and then I give the whole list, and I'm not going to read them here. It's not necessary. But there's 14 different endemic species of bird. Maybe the most interesting one are the swiftlets. There are 2 species of those. The island's many caves, such as those at Chalas Ek, are nesting grounds for the edible nest swiftlet, whose nests are prized in China for bird's nest soup. The islands are also have a number of endemic reptiles, toads, and frogs, such as the Andaman venomous crate snake and the Andaman water monitor. Crocodiles live throughout the island chain in varying densities. Now they are habitat restricted, so the population is stable but not large. Crocodile populations occur throughout the available mangrove habitat on all major islands, including a few creeks on Havelock. The species use the ocean as a means of travel between different rivers and estuaries, and are not commonly observed in the open sea. Locals avoid swimming near mangrove areas or in the mouths of creeks, although swimming in the open ocean is usually safe with the spotter around. And I did read about one American girl that got eaten over there. But at any rate, there is a sanctuary 45 miles from Havelock Island for saltwater crocodiles. Now, I come to the topic of ethnology and the history of evolutionary theory. The peoples of the Andamans have been the subjects of considerable ethnographic research for 2 centuries. The book, The Malay Archipelago, is an early book by the British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, when he was chronicling his scientific exploration during the 8-year period from 1854 to 1862. In those years, he explored the southern portion of the Malay Archipelago, including Malaysia, Singapore, the islands of Indonesia, which was then the Dutch East Indies, and the island of New Guinea. Now, in 1869, delayed by ill health, Wallace finally got his report published, and that book went through 10 editions over the next 30 years, and it has been reprinted many times since, not to mention having been translated into at least 8 languages. The book describes each island that he visited in turn, giving a detailed account of its physical and human geography, its volcanoes, and the variety of animals and plants that he found and collected. Because his description of the arduous adventures he undertook was so dramatic, it was greeted as an adventure story like Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. The preface notes that he traveled over 14,000 miles and collected almost 126,000 natural history specimens, mostly of insects and thousands of mollusks, but also birds, mammals, and reptiles. Wallace's book attracted many reviews from scientific and geographic periodicals. Nearly all reviewers, then and now, agree that he provided an interesting and comprehensive account of the geography, natural history, and peoples of the Andaman Archipelago. I recommend that those of you interested in the primitive communism of the current inhabitants start by reading this excellent report. There is a Kindle edition of Wallace's book now available, where the publishers describe it as a work of astounding scope and originality that provides some of the first evidence of the modern theory of evolution. Wallace, a contemporary of Charles Darwin, spent nearly a decade cataloging the plant and animal species which inhabited the unique geographical area of the Malay Archipelago, and remains to this day one of the most extensive works of natural history ever written, unquote. And finally, I want to mention that there is an excellent docudrama entitled Darwin's Darkest Hour that begins with a cinematic presentation of Wallace suffering from malaria in the Moluccas. These islands are not too far from the Andamans. The film illustrates an occurrence as important to science as Darwin's voyage of the Beagle. And that movie, by the way, Darwin's Darkest Hour, is available at Amazon and is on YouTube in its entirety. Now, that brings us specifically to the topic of primitive communism in the Andaman Islands, which have been inhabited for thousands of years. Actually, at least one of the islands is a kind of Jules Verne throwback to the Paleolithic. In fact, North Sentinel Island is sometimes called a living Paleolithic primitive communist, broad-spectrum, wild plant and animal resource-exploiting laboratory of hunting and gathering people. North Sentinel Island is a small island of 28 square miles, nestled among the Andaman Islands. The Indian government has banned all travel to the island because it is so dangerous. These islanders learned the hard way that the best way to handle intruders was to eat them. Consequently, we know very little about this place at the present time and its Sentinelese inhabitants. What we do know is that they are the oldest isolated tribe left in the world, a pre-Neolithic island tribe without any meaningful contact with the rest of the world for a long time. Where they came from and exactly when they got there are still mysteries. The Andamanese are the various indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands, themselves now part of India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands Union Territory in the southeastern part of the Bay of Bengal. The Andamanese peoples are among the groups considered negrito, owing to their dark skin and diminutive stature. All Andamanese traditionally lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle and appear to have lived in substantial isolation for thousands of years. The Andamanese arrived at the Andaman Islands around the last glacial maximum, that is somewhere between 26,000 and 20,000 BP, and for a long time it was incorrectly assumed that the Andamanese were an early Negrito population because of phenotypically similar physical characteristics to other Negroid peoples. That idea is no longer acceptable to most physical anthropologists, as the existence of a specific Negrito population is in doubt. Their inter-island commonalities are the result, in other words, of evolutionary convergence and a shared history. Specialists think people who were not direct descendants of the first Homo groups in South Asia settled the Andaman Islands less than 26,000 years ago, and then I give several references that were published as recently as 2013, and also an article on the mitochondrial DNA evidence that was published about 2011, I believe, in the Journal of Genetics and Genomics, the essence of which is the Andaman Archipelago was likely settled by modern humans from northeast India via the land bridge which connected the Andaman Archipelago and Myanmar around the last glacial maximum. Again, that's 26 to 20,000 years ago, a scenario in good agreement with the evidence from linguistic and paleoclimatic studies. The Andamanese peoples included the Great Andamanese and Jarawas of the Great Andaman Archipelago, the Jangil of Rutland Island, the Onge of Little Andaman Island, and the Sentinelese of North Sentinel Island. At the end of the AD 1700s, when they first came into sustained contact with outsiders, there were an estimated 7,000 Andamanese. In the next century, diseases, violent colonialists murdering them and stealing their land, nearly wiped them off the islands. Today there remain less than 450 Andamanese, with the Jangil being completely extinct. Only the Jarawa and the Sentinelese maintain a steadfast independence, by constantly repelling outsiders. And they do this by shooting at anybody, shooting arrows, spears, and whatever, anybody that tries to get off the beach. Anyway, the Andaman Island ideology is one of animism and animatism. As in the case with all primitive communists, the ideology of the indigenous Andamanese peoples was and is what anthropologists call animism and animatism. In all such systems, both animate and inanimate natural things and forces are ascribed supernatural power. In the Andamanese system, these forces have a headquarters on Saddle Peak of the Andaman Islands. Here reside the principal ghosts, spirits, and souls of people. Now, we come to the period of slave and feudal periods. From AD 800 to 1200, the Tamil Chola family dynasty created an empire that eventually extended from southeastern peninsular India to parts of Malaysia. Rajendra Chola I, from AD 1014 to 1042, took over the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and maintained them as a strategic naval base to launch a naval expedition against the Sumatran Srivijaya Empire. And that brings us to capitalism's rosy dawn. By the 1850s, when the Andamanese came into sustained contact by outside groups, there were, as we've seen, 7,000 Andamanese, and they were divided into the following major groups: the Great Andamanese, the Jarawa, the Jangil, the Onge, and the Sentinelese. Involuntary foreign settlers came initially as prisoners or indentured laborers. Free white and Asian farmers arrived later. The indigenous people were murdered for their land, and punitive expeditions by British troops were launched to exterminate those the private caps had not been able to catch. Various epidemic diseases finished the job, so that there are presently less than 450 still living indigenous Andamanese. The Jangles were soon extinct. The Great Andamanese were originally 10 distinct tribes with 5,000 people in total. Most of their tribes are extinct, and there are only 52 survivors. Most of them speak Hindi. The Onge were reduced to less than 100 people. Only the Jarawa and Sentinelese still maintain a steadfast independence, refusing most attempts at contacts, and their numbers are uncertain, but estimated to be in the low hundreds. Of the people who currently live in the Andaman Islands, about 1,000 are descendants of the original Andamanese Aboriginal inhabitants of the islands, who intermarried with incomers of other types. Now we come to the British colonial contact period. Beginning in 1789, the British East India Company, based out of Bengal, established a naval base and a penal colony on Chatham Island in the southeast bay of Great Andaman. The settlement is now known as Port Blair, which is also the capital now of the... But at any rate, after 2 years, the prison was moved to the northeast coast of Andaman that was renamed Port Cornwallis, situated on Ross Island. Disease and prisoner revolts made the company abandon the prison in May of 1796. In 1824, Port Cornwallis was the rendezvous of the fleet carrying the British Army to the First Burmese War. In the 1830s and 1840s, shipwrecked crews who landed on the Andamans were often killed and eaten by the natives, and the islands gained their reputation for cannibalism. In 1844, the UK regime lost the ships Runnymede and Britain during a storm. The few survivors reported that their mates had made a tasty meal for the indigenous folk. In 1855, the government proposed another settlement on the islands, including another penal colony. However, the Indian Sepoy Mutiny in 1857 forced a temporary delay in its construction, and because the rebellion gave the British so many prisoners, it made the new Andaman settlement and prison urgent. In November of 1857, construction began on a prison at Port Blair using convict labor. And so on the 17th of May of 1859, the Battle of Aberdeen, or the Battle of the Andaman Islands, was fought between the Great Andamanese tribe and the British. Fearing foreign invasion, and with the help from an escaped convict from cellular jail, the Great Andamanese tribe stormed the British post, but they were outnumbered and soon suffered heavy loss of life. Later, the Brit bosses placed the blame for the massacre on an escaped convict named Dudnath. The colonial regime said he had escaped with native prisoners, then changed sides, and informed the government of the tribe's plans. In whatever case, a memorial stands in the Andaman Water Sports Complex as a tribute to the people who lost their lives in that fight. Today, the tribe has been reduced to some 50 people, with less than 50% of them adults. The government of the Andaman Islands is making efforts to increase the headcount of this tribe. Back in 1867, the ship Nineveh wrecked on the reef of North Sentinel Island. The 86 survivors reached the beach in the ship's boats. On the third day, naked islanders attacked them with iron-tipped spears. One person from the ship escaped in a boat, and a British Royal Navy ship later rescued the others. For some time, sickness and mortality were high, but swamp reclamation and extensive forest clearance continued in that Andaman colony. On 8 February 1876, the Andaman colony became notorious with the assassination of the Viceroy Richard Southwell Bourke, 6th Earl of Mayo, on his visit to the colony. The assassin was a Muslim convict, a Pathan from Afghanistan named Sher Ali. In that same year, the two island groups, Andaman and Nicobar, were united under a Brit High Commissioner with headquarters at Port Blair. In 1858, the colony's development came under the direction of James Pattison Walker. He was appointed as part of the imperial response to the mutiny and rebellion of the previous year. The colony then became the main prison repository for political offenders. In 1910, the cellular jail at Port Blair was completed, and it had 698 cells designed for solitary confinement. Each cell measured 15 by 9 feet with a single ventilation window 10 feet above the floor. A contemporary prison of the same kind still exists on New Providence Island at Fox Hill in the Bahamas, and I've had the opportunity to visit. At any rate, a notable prisoner there was Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, an Indian pro-independence activist, lawyer, politician, poet, writer, and playwright. He advocated the reconversion of the converted Hindus back to Hindu religion. The Indians imprisoned here referred to the island and its prison as Kalapani, or Black Water. A 1996 film was set on the island and took the term as its title, Kalapani. Thousands of prisoners died of harsh treatment and of the harsh living and working conditions in this camp, much the same as Fox Hill Bahamians do every day, to this very day. The Viper Chain Gang jail on Viper Island was another hellhole reserved for those the Brit colonial authorities considered troublemakers, and it was the site of many disciplinary hangings. In the 20th century, it became a convenient place to house prominent members of India's independence movement. Japanese replaced Brits as rulers of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands during World War II. Nominally, they were put under the authority of Ars Humat-i-Azad Hind, local boss of the Japanese puppet Provisional Government of Free India. That regime was headed by Subhas Chandra Bose. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands were renamed by him Shahid, that means martyr, and Swaraj, or self-rule. On the 30th of December 1943, during that Japanese occupation, the Nipponese puppet Bose raised the false flag of Indian independence. General Loganathan of the Indian National Army was governor of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which Japan had annexed to their provisional government. He said before leaving the islands, the Japanese rounded up and executed 750 innocent people. After the end of the war, the islands returned to British control before becoming part of the newly independent state of India. At the close of World War II, the British government announced its intention to abolish the penal settlement. The government proposed to employ former forced labor inmates as free laborers to develop the island's fisheries, timber, and agricultural resources. In exchange, the former prison inmates would be granted passage to the inland mainland or the right to settle on the islands. I don't know whether they got any money or not. On the 15th of August 1947, the penal colony was closed when India gained independence, and since then it served as a museum to the independence movement. In April 1998, the American photographer John S. Callahan organized the first surfing project in the Andamans, starting from Phuket in Thailand, with the assistance of Southeast Asia Liveaboards, SEAL, a UK-owned dive charter company. With a crew of international professional surfers, they crossed the Andaman Sea on the yacht Crescent and cleared formalities in Port Blair. That group proceeded to Little Andaman Island, where they spent 10 days surfing several spots for the first time, including Jarawa Point near Hut Bay, and the long right reef point at the southwest tip of the island named Kumari Point. The resulting article in Surfer magazine, called Quest for Fire, by journalist Sam George, put the Andaman Islands on the surfing map for the first time. Footage of the waves of the Andaman Islands also appeared in the film Thicker Than Water, shot by documentary filmmaker Jack Johnson, who later achieved world fame as a popular musician. Callahan went on to make several more surfing projects in the Andamans, including a trip to the Nicobar Islands in 1999. As of 2011, the population of the Andamans was 343,000. The bulk of the population originated from immigrants who came to the island after colonial times, mainly of Bengali, Hindustani, and Tamil backgrounds. Port Blair is the main community on the islands and the administrative center of the Union Territory. Photography makes it look like a British colonial town in the Caribbean to me. The Andaman Islands form a single administrative district within India's Union Territory. The Andaman District, although the Nicobar Islands were separated and established as the new Nicobar District in 1974, is also part of the Union Territory of India. And finally, we come to the literary references. The islands are prominently featured in Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes mystery, The Sign of Four, as well as M.M.K's Death in the Andamans. The magistrate in Lady Gregory's play, Spreading the News, had formerly served in the islands. Marianne Wiggins' 1989 novel, John Dollar, is set on one of the islands when the characters begin an expedition from Burma to celebrate King George's birthday. After an earthquake and a tsunami, it becomes a grim survival story. A principal character in the book Six Suspects by Vikas Swarup is from the Andaman Islands. Kalapani, I just mentioned, and Siri Chalai, a 1996 Indian film by Priya Darshan, depicts the Indian freedom struggle and the lives of prisoners in the cellular jail in Port Blair. Island's End is a 2011 a novel by Padma Venkatraman about the training of an indigenous shaman. And in terms of getting there, the only commercial airport in the islands is Veer Savarkar International Airport in Port Blair, which has scheduled services to Kolkata, Chennai, New Delhi, Bangalore, Visakhapatnam, and other Indian towns. The airport is under the control of the Indian Navy. Previously, only daylight operations were allowed, but since the beginning of 2016, night flights have also operated. A small mile-long airstrip is located near the eastern shore of North Andaman, near Diglipur. Due to the length of the routes and the small number of airlines flying to the islands, fares have traditionally been relatively expensive, although they are cheaper for locals. Fares are high during the peak seasons of spring and winter, although they continue to decrease with the expansion of the civil aviation industry in India. And that brings us to our conclusion of our discussion of the Andamans. Going back over that, I think that there are a couple of things that you want to take a look at. You want to read Wallace's book, and there's a recent copy of it published by Amazon. And you also want to take a look at Darwin's Darkest Hour to get a good idea of a lot of the circumstances surrounding both Wallace and Darwin working together and their original discovery of biological evolution. And remember that there's still at least one, if not two, islands in the Andamans which are living in an absolutely Paleolithic way of life. and probably the last place in the world that anybody's going to be able to study them. Although maybe nobody's going to get to study them because they don't like the idea of any foreigners coming in there whatsoever. So I guess you'd be taking your life in your hands. There might be some way to figure that thing out in the long run. But that concludes our discussion of the islands of the Indian Ocean. And next we're going to be moving on to Persia and Southwest Asia.